I hope everybody can hear me with the technology. Um, I will basically speak for about 10 minutes on the overall situation in terms of the impact of COVID-19, not only on Nepal but the region. I think it's very important to see it that way. And at the end, as you had suggested, I'll talk a little bit about what the World Bank is doing as part of this. So let me talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID globally, of it globally and in the region, and then we can talk about Nepal. I don't think I need to tell all of you that the impacts of the virus and the pandemic itself. Yeah, I don't need to tell you how bad it's in terms of the impact, in terms of how it's going to change the world in which we occupy, at least for the next 2 to 3 years. I don't need to tell you how impactful it is. It is something of, it's a worldwide pandemic, obviously, we all know this. The impact of it in terms of human lives has been quite tragic. The impacts on the economy over the next few years are going to be, quite unfortunate, and they're going to be vast, they're going to be global, and South Asia region will be impacted and Nepal will be impacted. However, the idea, and this is why we are all here, and this is why the World Bank is here, is really for us to focus on how we can reduce the amount of impact and to make sure that the world, and Nepal particularly also for us, emerges out of this and comes back to its development path. So the idea is not to think of it as, obviously it's very serious, but we need to think of it in terms of what happens when we get out of this, and how do we reduce the impacts, particularly on the poor and vulnerable, and what do we need to do to get Nepal back on the path towards development. So we need to always look forward, and we need to always be positive, and most importantly, we need to be proactive, because there is a way out, and there is something that we need to do. First, let's talk about the COVID in terms of, the world. We know the world next year, as a result of COVID, is going to go through a significant drop in growth, GDP growth throughout the whole world. In South Asia region, we are also going to experience, this is all of South Asia, the 8 countries of South Asia, we're going to see a significant drop in growth. Before COVID, we had assumed that GDP growth in South Asia was going to be, I'm looking at my numbers, 6.3%. But now, as a result of COVID-19 and the coronavirus impacts, we expect that for this fiscal year, which is fiscal year 2020, as economic journalists, to really understand why this type of recession as a result of coronavirus and COVID-19 is different than the others. This is something I want to focus on. It's not just a recession, it's a different type of recession altogether. And it's unique in many ways, and we need to really understand why this is going to be different. Why am I focusing on this? Because if we understand that this recession is going to be different than the other ones in the DNA, in the basic parts of the recession, then we will understand why we need to have different tools and to focus on different things, as for government, private sector, World Bank, and others. One is usually what you find, and you all know this as economic journalists, when we go through the business cycle, when we go through economic cycles, usually you find that in a downturn, usually in the first things that are impacted are investments and the demand for more durable goods. Usually during these times, that's what, it's a demand-driven recession. In this case of COVID and coronavirus, it's actually a supply-driven. This is basically a supply shock rather than a demand shock, in a sense, if you think about it. Usually in situations, you find that investments and demand for durable services and durable goods are the hardest hit. However, now we find it's different. It's a unique recession because it started basically with the service sectors. So the service, certainly in Nepal, with tourism, with others, with restaurants, etc., the recession started with an impact which is different than other recessions, and it focuses on the services sector, which is a big issue in Nepal when you look at the amount of tourism, the amount that services play. And recovery packages focuses on unlocking supply, making sure that there's delivery of goods and things of that sort. The third one is what we're observing now is this idea of a social panic and hoarding. We see a lot of people because they expect and hope, and the good news is so far we have not seen any food shortages globally, although there is price inflation, etc. People are acting as if they fear that there's going to be a food shortage things, and we've seen what's happening with the gas, with the cooking gas. So people are hoarding, and hoarding means you keep and you sort of store inventory in your house. What that means is that those people who are more vulnerable and cannot afford to hoard are going to actually be more impacted. Gas and cooking and rice and dal and bat and all this stuff, but somebody who's poor can't do it. So then my hoarding, my ability to afford these things is going to impact others. So this is what's unique about COVID. Now, what's going to happen in Nepal? Obviously, Nepal, as I said, is not going to be different than others countries. And according to our latest projection, we also assume that the GDP in Nepal is going to go roughly between, according to our estimates, from the lowest case scenario is 1.5% GDP in this fiscal year. And to a more realistic scenario, maybe the upside is 2.8% in FY20 before it returns to roughly 3% growth in FY21, and we will see a gradual rise. So it's a big hit for Nepal. Okay, so I think, look, the government is working. I think there are some priorities. I mean, a lot has to be done next year, and a lot of it requires budget. And, obviously you need to prioritize, not everything. This immediate health response will probably not only be required in the next month, 2 or 3, but in case we have a second wave of COVID in next winter, so next year made issue. So the first one is priority number 1, the health systems. And this is where we have also been helping them. And the bank has provided immediately, even a few weeks ago, 29 million for the immediate COVID response, including PPE kits, testing kits, truck upgrading facilities, ventilators, etc. That's one. The second one is immediate social assistance, providing continued social assistance to people and jobs. There is going to be a huge amount of people who were supposed to go work in Qatar, in Dubai, in Malaysia, everywhere, and they're going to be in Nepal. So the situations like the Prime Minister's employment program, others are going to be very important now to create jobs. That's number 2. Number 3 is we need to continue to focus on the real sector. As I said, this is a supply shock, what we're having now. We need to make sure that the real sector of the economy, particularly the products being produced and the services by the MSMEs, continue. So we need to ensure that the financial sector has liquidity, that we need to make sure that their supply chains are built, and that MSMEs don't go out of business. So we need to provide the real sector and making sure that these guys don't go out of business. The 4th priority is macro stability. There's going to be huge spending needs. So there needs to be prioritization. Debt needs to be recalibrated. Even the bank, we have a big program in Nepal. We are moving about 18% of our portfolio from existing projects, canceling them and putting them towards COVID so we don't increase the debt burden of the government. I think this is very important. Making, the schools, the federalism, the provinces, the palikas, making sure that they have the IT technology to work in a new type of world is, I think, going to be very important. Those are basically the 6 priorities. The first priority, and this is where the World Bank, not only the World Bank, but the World Bank Group, when the IFC, etc., is helping, is the immediate health response. Making sure that the national laboratories, for instance, are stocked up. And this is where our 30 million, 29 million emergency project is going. Having the right hospital beds, having the expertise, having the test kits, having etc. I think this is the number 1. This is not only in terms of money, but in terms of a much bigger problem that we're seeing in the world. And that is that throughout the world, there's a huge demand for masks, huge demand for PPE kits, for ventilators, for etc. So the World Bank, in addition to financing, we're working with the government to help them with global procurement of these goods in a very transparent way from people outside of Nepal. So this is one area. The second one immediately is to protect the poorest and the most vulnerable. That's where we can help. And this is where we are moving around 18% of our portfolio to transmit it to more creation of jobs, immediate job creation, social transfers, things of that sort. The third one is to protect jobs and businesses. And this is where we will work with the government on specific policies, support, and we are talking regularly with the Honorable Minister of Finance, the central bank governor. He has put together an advisory panel which includes the World Bank, the ADB, IMF, Asia Infrastructure Bank, and we're advising them on ways on what NRB MOF can continue to do to encourage and to ensure that the MSMEs, small and medium enterprises continue to work. And then the third priority is to shorten the time to recovery. So the idea is how to continue to work together now to ensure that there's continued supply chains, continued growth, that, you know, after the lockdown is over, that companies have access to cash flow, access to working capital, etc., so that the time to recovery from right now survival to revival is the shortest. And then the recovery, and this is where we go back to the usual agenda of private sector growth and things of that sort. So we are splitting it up into these sort of 4 phases, and for each of them we're engaging with the government. Ruwan, the good news that was coming soon. As you know, this is the week of the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, where ideally we would have had the spring meetings in Washington, but because of the travel restriction, we had it virtually. There has been a lot of discussions by all the members of the World Bank. We have to protect the poorest and the most vulnerable. What we see is a lot of, you know, not only in Nepal, but in a lot of the countries in South Asia, as a result of this crisis, you know, and the unique nature of the crisis, a lot of them are leaving the urban areas or going back to the rural areas. As a result of this, there's usually a pushback towards poverty. So the immediate policy is to provide assistance, whether job creation at this point, and social transfers to them, so that these vulnerable groups don't fall into immediate poverty. There is a risk on that. Rural tends to be obviously where the agriculture is. At the same time, we need to develop to make sure that the supply chains are not broken. So the farmers, others who are there, and I know this is very difficult in this time with the COVID, but to focus on supply chains. And thirdly is cash flow. Farmers, micro enterprises, rural enterprises need continued cash flow. And this is where, through the banking sector and through government policy, the cash flow there, we need them to survive for this period.